No work today. It's Christmas, the American guard said, and the women standing in the assembly yard didn't move. Their breath hung white in the Montana dawn. The barracks smelled of damp wool and stale sweat. Most had been awake since 4, waiting for the whistle that meant roll call, and another day splitting firewood or scrubbing kitchen floors. The guard repeated himself slower, and one of the younger women translated the English into German. Still, no one moved. Christmas meant nothing when you were cold and your hands were cracked and you hadn't heard from home in 8 months. The guard stepped back. He gestured toward the mess hall where yellow light spilled from the windows. He said something else, but the wind took the words. Then he left, boots crunching gravel, and the women looked at each other with the blank caution of people who had learned not to hope. Inside the barracks, someone coughed. A tin cup rattled against a bed frame. Outside, the Montana sky was the color of old iron, and the air smelled like snow that hadn't fallen yet. One of the older women, a former factory supervisor from Dusseldorf, crossed her arms. She said they should wait, see what this was. Another woman, younger, said she smelled something. Not the usual oatmeal and black coffee, something sweeter, something that made her stomach clench. The older woman shook her head, but she was already moving toward the door. They walked in a loose group, 15 women in patched gray dresses and donated cardigans that didn't fit. The ground was frozen. The mess hall sat at the center of the camp, a long wooden structure with a tin roof and windows fogged from heat inside. As they got closer, the smell grew stronger, roasting meat, butter, cinnamon. One woman stopped walking. She pressed a hand to her mouth. The others kept going slower now, and when they reached the door, they hesitated. Through the glass, they could see the Americans moving between tables, setting down plates and bowls. The tables were covered with white cloth. Not the usual oilcloth, but real linen pressed smooth, and in the center of each table sat a small pine branch tied with red string. The door swung open. An American sergeant stood there, young with pale eyebrows and a face that hadn't learned how to hide kindness yet. He smiled and waved them in. The warmth hit them first, then the light. The mess hall was brighter than they'd ever seen it. Every overhead bulb lit, and along the far wall someone had strung paper garlands in red and green. The tables were set with real plates, white ceramic, not the usual tin trays. At each place sat a folded napkin and a fork and knife that gleamed under the lights. The women filed in slowly. They didn't speak. Their shoes squeaked on the clean floor. The Americans watched them but didn't rush them, and that absence of hurry felt stranger than anything else. At the serving line, the counter was laid out with food they couldn't name at first. A whole roasted turkey, a skin golden and split where the juices had run, mashed potatoes in a steel basin, steam rising, butter pooling yellow in the center, glazed carrots, green beans with slivers of almond, cranberry sauce, dark red and jellied, still holding the shape of the can. Dinner rolls stacked in a basket, each one shiny with egg wash and pies. 3 pies on a separate table, their crusts crimped and browned, one leaking purple juice through a star-shaped vent. The women stood there. One of them touched the edge of the counter as if to make sure it was real. The stainless steel was warm. An American cook, an older man with flour on his apron, gestured for them to take plates. He said something in English, soft, almost apologetic. The translator, the young woman who had been a teacher in Leipzig, whispered that he was saying to take as much as they wanted. There was plenty. They moved through the line. The Americans served them, spooning potatoes onto plates, slicing turkey, laying down thick pieces that bent the tines of their forks. The cranberry sauce slid onto the plate in a solid red disc. One woman held out her plate, and the cook added another roll, then another, and when she tried to say it was enough, he shook his head and smiled. She looked down at her plate. It was heaped. The gravy had already started to soak into the turkey and the potatoes, and she could smell the butter and the meat, and the faint metal tang of the cranberries, and her hands were shaking. She carried the plate to a table and sat down. The linen napkin felt stiff and foreign in her lap. She didn't touch the food. She waited. The others joined her one by one, carrying plates piled high. They sat in silence. The Americans were still moving around, filling water glasses, bringing out more rolls, checking that everyone had gotten through the line. One of them, a private with red hair and freckles, paused at a table and pointed to a pitcher of milk. Real milk, white and cold, condensation beating on the glass. He poured a cup for a woman who hadn't asked, set it down beside her plate, and walked away before she could respond. She stared at the milk. The last time she had seen milk like that was before the war, before the ration cards, before the bombers came, and the city smelled like burning plaster for weeks. She picked up the glass. It was heavy, cold. The milk coated her tongue sweet and clean, and she set the glass down too hard. It clicked against the table. A single drop spilled across the cloth. The record player started. Someone had put on a record, and the sound came through scratchy and warm. A big band playing something slow and bright. The Americans were eating now, too, sitting at their own tables, talking in low voices, laughing occasionally. The mess hall smelled like Thanksgiving and wood smoke, and the faint medicinal edge of the disinfectant they used on the floors. Outside the windows, the sky had gone lighter, gray instead of black, and snowflakes had started to drift down, small and lazy, catching the light. Inside it was warm. The radiators clanked and hissed. One of the younger women picked up her fork. She cut a piece of turkey. It was tender, falling apart, and when she put it in her mouth, she closed her eyes. The salt and the richness and the way it melted made her throat tighten. She chewed slowly, swallowed, opened her eyes. The others were watching her. She nodded. One by one they started to eat. The potatoes were smooth and buttery, still hot enough to burn the roof of your mouth if you weren't careful. The green beans had been cooked with something savory, maybe bacon, and they snapped between your teeth. The cranberry sauce was sweeter than anything they'd tasted in years, almost too sweet, but it cut the richness of the meat, and they ate it anyway. The rolls were soft inside with a crust that crackled when you tore it, and the butter was pale yellow and melted into the bread before you could spread it. They ate without talking. Some of them ate slowly, savoring each bite. Others ate quickly, as if the food might vanish, and then slowed down when their stomachs started to protest. The Americans didn't watch them. They ate their own meals and poured more coffee, and once the red-haired private came by with the milk pitcher again, and refilled glasses without asking. It was the pie that broke them. The cook came out with a cart, 3 pies balanced on top, and he started cutting slices. Apple, cherry, pumpkin. He served each woman a slice, setting it down on a small plate with a fork. The apple pie was still warm. The crust was flaky, and the filling smelled like cinnamon and cloves, and the apples had been cooked down to a soft sweetness that made your mouth water before you even tasted it. The woman from Dusseldorf, the factory supervisor, who had told them to wait and see, picked up her fork. She cut into the pie. The steam rose, and she could see the apples inside, tender and golden, and she took a bite. The sugar and the spice and the buttery crust filled her mouth, and she set the fork down. Her hands were shaking again. She tried to pick the fork back up, but her fingers wouldn't work. She pressed her palms flat against the table. Her shoulders started to shake. Across from her, the young teacher put down her own fork. She was crying, not loud, but her face was wet, and she wasn't trying to hide it. She wiped her cheeks with the linen napkin, and that made it worse. The napkin soft and clean against her skin, and she put her face in her hands. It spread through the tables like a wave. One woman after another set down her fork and started to cry. Some of them cried quietly, tears running down their faces while they stared at their plates. Others sobbed, shoulders heaving, and the sound filled the mess hall, raw and unguarded. The Americans stopped talking. They looked at each other, uncertain, and the young sergeant, who had opened the door, stood up as if to help, but didn't know what to do. The older cook put a hand on his shoulder and shook his head. Let them be. The record player kept going, the music incongruous and too cheerful, and someone got up and lifted the needle. The silence that followed was thick. You could hear the radiators and the snow tapping against the windows and the sound of women crying who had not cried in months, maybe years, because there had been no point and no safety in it. They cried because the food was good, and they hadn't expected that. They cried because the Americans had said no work today and it was Christmas and they had forgotten what that meant. They cried because the turkey was tender and the milk was cold and the pie tasted like home or like something they had lost or like a kindness they couldn't reconcile with everything else. They cried because the linen was clean and the napkins were folded and someone had strung paper garlands as if it mattered. They cried because the sergeant had smiled, and the cook had given them extra rolls, and the red-haired private had poured milk without being asked. They cried because they were prisoners and they were far from home, and they had expected nothing, and been given everything, and the gap between those two things was too wide to cross without breaking. The woman from Dusseldorf lifted her head. Her face was blotchy and wet. She looked at the pie half-eaten, the fork lying beside it. She picked up the fork. Her hands were steadier now. She took another bite, tasted the same sweet, warm, buttery. She chewed slowly and swallowed and took another bite. Around her, the other women were doing the same, eating and crying, crying and eating. The Americans sat quietly. One of them, an older corporal with gray at his temples, had tears in his own eyes, but he didn't move. He just sat there, hands folded on the table, and watched. Outside, the snow was falling heavier now, coating the gravel yard and the barracks roofs and the bare branches of the cottonwood trees beyond the fence. Inside, the mess hall smelled like cinnamon and coffee and the faint salt of tears, and the women ate their pie and wept, and no one told them to stop. When the plates were empty, the Americans cleared them away, stacking them gently, refilling coffee cups, bringing out more pie for anyone who wanted it. Some of the women took seconds. Others sat with their hands wrapped around their coffee mugs, letting the warmth seep into their fingers. The young teacher got up and walked to the window. She pressed her forehead against the cold glass and looked out at the snow. Behind her, the mess hall was quiet. The Americans were cleaning up, scraping plates, wrapping leftover turkey in wax paper. The older cook was humming something under his breath. The sergeant was folding up the linen tablecloths, smoothing the creases before he set them aside. The woman at the window watched the snowfall and tried to remember the last time she had felt warm and full at the same time. She couldn't. She turned back to the room. The other women were still sitting, some of them talking now in low voices, some of them just staring at their empty plates as if the food might reappear. The red-haired private came by with a basket. He set it on the table and the women looked inside. Oranges, a dozen of them, bright and absurd, against the gray Montana winter. He gestured for them to take one. The woman from Dusseldorf picked one up. It was heavy and cold, and the skin was dimpled, and when she pressed her thumb against it, the peel released a sharp citrus smell that made her eyes sting. She hadn't seen an orange in 3 years. She held it in both hands and felt the weight and the texture and the impossible fact of it. The private was watching her. He said something in English and translator whispered that he was saying Merry Christmas. The woman nodded. She didn't know what to say. She held the orange and nodded, and he smiled and moved to the next table. By noon, the meal was over. The Americans told them they could return to the barracks. No work for the rest of the day. They could rest or walk the yard if they wanted or sit in the dayroom where someone had started a fire in the stove. The women stood slowly as if moving too fast might break the spell. They carried their oranges like talismans, cradling them against their chests. Some of them stopped to thank the cook. He nodded and waved them off, embarrassed, and went back to wiping down the counter. Outside, the snow had slowed. The yard was white and clean, and the air smelled like cold and pine, and the smoke from the dayroom chimney. The women walked back to the barracks in a loose group, slower than they had come. And when they got inside, they sat on their bunks and peeled their oranges, and the smell filled the room, bright and sharp and impossibly sweet. That night, one of them wrote a letter home, though she didn't know if it would ever arrive. She wrote about the turkey and the pie and the milk and the oranges. She wrote about the sergeant who smiled, and the cook who gave extra rolls, and the private who poured milk and said, Merry Christmas. She wrote about how she had cried and couldn't stop and didn't know why, except that the pie was warm and the napkin was clean, and no one had told them to hurry. She wrote that it was Christmas, and the Americans had said no work today, and she had eaten until she was full, and it had been the strangest and saddest and most beautiful thing she could remember. She folded the letter and tucked it under her pillow. Outside, the snow had started again. Inside the barracks, the radiator clanked, and someone was humming something soft. Maybe a hymn, maybe just a tune they remembered from before. The woman from Dusseldorf lay on her bunk with her orange on the windowsill beside her. The peel curled in a long spiral, and she stared at the ceiling and tried to hold on to the feeling of being warm and full and safe, even if only for a day.